Hey, Michael with XForcePC. Wanted to take a moment to answer a few questions I've gotten on YouTube that just are a little too wordy to try to type. So Juan asked me, if I add 3 monitors with NVIDIA Surround and 1 monitor plugged into the motherboard for a 4th display, will that have a frame rate drop? If you're going to use 4 displays, which it sounds like Juan's going to do, you can save some frames per second by using NVIDIA Surround for your 3 forward display monitors. Now the 4th one that he talks about, plugging into the motherboard, it's a that depends is the answer. So motherboard graphics are slow. So if you're going to use, let's say, Air Manager, or you're going to display your charts on it or whatever, then you can use the onboard graphics if you want. Now keep in mind, you'll have to turn on the onboard graphics in your BIOS. Most motherboards are set up such that if you put a video card in, it automatically disables the onboard video, and even if you plug something in there, it's not going to work. Now most video cards will actually support 4 displays. So typically you do not use the motherboard port to leverage performance. You might use it because let's say you've used all 4 of your video ports on your graphics card and you want to hook up a 5th monitor. But the bottom line is that anything you plug into the motherboard port needs to be something that doesn't require fast graphics, fast speed, like a view of X-Plane. So Juan, my recommendation would be set up NVIDIA Surround on your 3 visual monitors, and then whatever you want to use the 4th for, just have it plugged into the graphics card. Again, you'll save some frames per second with the using the NVIDIA Surround, and then you can do whatever you want with the 4th. But if you must use the onboard graphics, number 1, you're going to have to enable it in the BIOS, and number 2, it can't be something that requires fast graphics like another view of X-Plane. Black Mambolim, these are just YouTube handles, wants me to check out the RTX Titan. This is the graphics card that's above the 2080 Ti. It has 24 gigs of RAM. It is not designed for gaming. And if you go out there and you look at some of the other YouTubers that have done, like Linus Tech Tips, Gamers Nexus, some of those guys, Jay's 2 Cents, most of them at least, have tested this card, and the only thing that's really good for is professional type stuff, 3D rendering, things like that, something that will require 24 gigs of RAM. But the difference in performance in gaming between the 2080 Ti and the RTX, Titan? Yeah, RTX Titan is very, very small. And so you want to go check that out. You don't want to drop $2,000, or maybe it's $2,500 for that graphics card. I think it's about somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500. It's very expensive. Don't buy that for X-Plane, is the bottom line. That's the short answer. Another question I get a lot is, adding a 2nd graphics card help? X-Plane will only look at 1 graphics card, your main graphics card. You could add a 2nd one if you want to hook up more monitors, but all of the graphical work will be done by the primary card. So the only reason for adding a 2nd card would be to get more video ports. Typically, once you get to about 4 monitors of X-Plane, you've kind of reached the point where if you added another one, the frame rate would be so unacceptable you wouldn't do it anyway. So also there's something called SLI, or Crossfire, and that's where you take 2 identical graphics cards, put them in the computer, and they both work, and one of them does half of the display, the other one does the other half of the display, but the game or simulator must be SLI compatible, and X-Plane is not, and more games are not compliant with SLI or Crossfire because single GPUs have gotten so fast that the need to take 2 of them and sort of bond them together to get even more performance has become less necessary. And in almost every case in X-Plane, when you're limited by your performance or by your hardware, at this time, 11.31 of X-Plane, it's almost always processor related. It's rarely are you going to put a 2080 Ti or a 2080 in and you're going to bottleneck the system on the graphics card. It's almost always going to be processor at that point. Now sure, if you have a 1050 Ti in a computer and you're running 3 screens, okay, yeah, the bottleneck might be the 1050 Ti. But if you're up at a 2070, 2080, 2080 Ti and you're not getting the frame rate you want, your bottleneck's probably the processor. And that's not to say your processor's slow. It just is, there's more work to do on performance when it comes to X-Plane. Someone asked, Will's Wings asks if Vulcan will help. Vulcan, from what I've been told, is going to level the playing field between AMD and NVIDIA. Right now, if you use an NVIDIA processor, everything else in the system is equal, but you use an AMD processor versus an Intel, 2 processors that are supposed to be on the same level. In X-Plane, that AMD processor is going to run about half the frame rate. Same holds true on graphics. I've tested the new Radeon 7, and it's supposed to be comparable to the RTX 2080, but the frame rates I'm getting in an otherwise identical system is half. I'm getting frame rates like in the teens on a 4K display, whereas I'm getting over 30 on a 2080. That is not necessarily AMD's fault. I can tell you AMD is a terrible performer on X-Plane, both from a processor and graphics card standpoint. But again, that's not necessarily AMD's fault. That could be just as easily Laminar Research's fault. And Vulcan, at least on the graphics side, is supposed to help bring up AMD. It's not necessarily going to raise NVIDIA. It might, but what we should see is AMD cards performing as expected with their counterparts on the NVIDIA side. Right now, you can just take the frame rate and cut it in half, and that's what you're going to get on a comparable AMD card. And again, I'm not saying it's their fault, it's just how it is. This is 1131 of X-Plane, so if you're watching this a year from now, this might not be correct. Yeah, so Rai asked me about the Radeon 7 and have I tested it, and yeah, I have, and yeah, it's half the frame rate of a 2080 right now. Someone asked if I ever considered VR. Yeah, I've done VR, I've tried VR, tested VR. And I've got videos on this already. In short, I'm going to keep this short. When you use VR, the immersion effect is incredible. You think you're really in a plane. The sounds, you feel like you can reach out and you can touch things because it's 3-dimensional. It looks like the yoke is right there in front of you. But, there's always a but. The part that I can't accept or is a no-go for me is the fuzziness. You can't read your instruments. You cannot read them. The only way to read the instruments is to lean your head in, read, okay, that's my airspeed or that's my frequency, okay, and then lean back out. Because there's just not enough pixels there. It looks like you're up at a screen door and you've got the screen door up in front of your face, and then you've also taken your glasses off because you need glasses, and that's sort of what it feels like you're looking at. Now, if you're just going to zoom around and look at the scenery and all that, it's great. Helicopters is great, but if you need to practice anything to do with instruments, you need to read your instruments, we need to wait for the next generation of VR headsets that are going to have more pixels that will allow you to be able to read your instruments. Someone asked me about SLI. I answered that earlier. Piper Warrior Sim Project wanted to know if I'm going to check out the Ryzen 3600X when it comes out. I'll definitely check that out. I have a feeling that it's going to be, unless X-Plane changes something, it's going to be more of the same. Half the frame rate you would expect to get is probably what we're going to get, but hopefully with the optimizations that the X-Plane folks can continue to work on, and maybe Vulcan, we'll see that not be the case. AMD excels right now in providing you lots and lots of threads or cores. Most of their processors are 8-core processors, and they have Threadripper, which is even more. But where they suffer a little bit is on per-thread performance. If you have a program that's just wanting one really fast core, and that's what gaming is a lot of, 1 or 2 really fast cores, AMD lags behind a little bit. And then you throw on top of that the fact that X-Plane seems to have an AMD penalty associated with it. It's a pretty stark difference. So hopefully by the time the 3600X comes out, maybe there'll be some changes on the X-Plane side. If you're watching this and you have an AMD processor and you have an AMD graphics card and you want better performance right now, you'll be stunned by the difference if you go to a decent i5 processor and let's say an RTX 2060 or 2070 graphics card. It's a huge difference. And again, I don't blame AMD for that necessarily. It just is what it is. And hopefully it does change. That's it. That's the questions I had on, at least for today, to answer from YouTubers. Hopefully that helped some of you.